On November 20, 1975, 26-year-old Joan Harrison was reported missing in Preston, Lancashire, England. She was a mother of two and known locally. She was married twice during her life. On the day she disappeared, she had been out visiting pubs in the Preston city centre, returning later in the evening without being seen alive again. The last confirmed sighting occurred after she left a hostel where she sometimes stayed. When Harrison did not return home and could not be contacted, family and friends reported her missing to the local police. An initial inquiry was opened, and officers conducted enquiries with people who knew her, seeking to understand her routines, relationships, and any possible reasons for her disappearance. Detectives sought information from those who had seen her that afternoon and evening. On November 22, 1975, 2 days after she was last seen, Harrison's body was found in a disused lock-up garage on Berwick Road in the Avenham area of Preston. The discovery was made by members of the public who noticed unusual activity in the vicinity of the garage. Responding officers from Lancashire Constabulary secured the scene and began an examination consistent with a suspected homicide. The post-mortem examination conducted by forensic pathologists showed that Harrison had died from multiple blunt force injuries, indicative of a violent attack. Semen was found on and in her body, indicating sexual assault. A distinct bite mark was observed on one of her breasts. Several items of jewelry, including 2 gold wedding rings, were missing from her person. The positioning of her clothing and other details of the scene were documented carefully by investigators during the forensic examination. At the time of her death, police considered several lines of inquiry. Because the nature of the injuries and sexual assault appeared similar to patterns seen in serial sexual homicides in northern England, some investigators initially explored whether the crime could be linked to the Yorkshire Ripper killings. That violent serial murderer, later identified as Peter Sutcliffe, was active in the mid-1970s and targeted women in northern England. However, later forensic evidence ruled out his involvement in Harrison's murder. The initial investigation included interviews with witnesses, canvass of the local area, and forensic processing of the crime scene. Officers examined Harrison's personal contacts, recent movements, and any persons she may have been seen with on the day she disappeared. Despite these efforts, detectives could not identify a suspect in the months that followed. No reliable forensic matches to known individuals were made, and there were no clear eyewitness accounts identifying a potential assailant at or near the scene. The case became a cold case as investigative leads dried up. Officers maintained the file and periodically reviewed it, but for many years it remained unresolved. The body was buried, and Harrison's name was recorded in missing persons and homicide records. Her murder was one of several unsolved violent crimes from the 1970s in the northwest of England. Decades passed with no prosecution. Public interest in the case continued among some local historians and true crime researchers, but no breakthrough occurred until advancements in forensic science offered new possibilities. In the early 2000s and into the 2010s, police cold case units in the United Kingdom began re-examining unsolved murders using modern DNA analysis and more sensitive laboratory techniques that were unavailable in the 1970s. In 2008, a man named Christopher Smith from Leeds provided a DNA sample to police when he was stopped for a routine matter and gave a swab as part of the procedure. Smith had a long and documented criminal history, including convictions for assault, theft, and sexual offenses related to sex attacks. His DNA sample was entered into the criminal DNA database following the procedures in force at the time. Several years later, forensic scientists revisited the biological evidence from the Harrison murder.
Using advances in DNA profiling technology, they were able to extract and analyze DNA left at the 1975 crime scene. That profile was matched to the sample that had been collected from Christopher Smith in 2008. This match provided a direct genetic link between Smith and the biological material associated with Harrison's murder. Investigators also located a 3-page note that Smith had written on January 29, 2008, the day before his death from a terminal illness. In that handwritten document, he stated he could no longer live with the guilt and expressed remorse for the pain he had caused. The note referenced having lived with guilt for more than 20 years. Although Smith died before any criminal charges could be brought, the note and the DNA match constituted compelling evidence indicating his responsibility for Harrison's death. Law enforcement agencies, including the Crown Prosecution Service, reviewed the totality of the evidence. Detectives and prosecutors concluded that the DNA evidence from the 1975 crime scene, combined with the handwritten note and Smith's documented criminal history, provided sufficient evidence that would have supported murder charges against him if he had been alive. Authorities publicly announced that they believed Christopher Smith was the person who bludgeoned Joan Harrison to death in 1975. The identification of Smith as the perpetrator marked the resolution of a cold case that had remained open for more than 30 decades. Although no prosecution could take place due to his death in 2008, investigators described the resolution as providing clarity about who was responsible. Police offered support to Harrison's surviving relatives, acknowledging the impact the murder had had on them over the years. During the course of the original investigation, some hoaxes and misinformation also complicated efforts. A separate individual, John Humble, known as Wearside Jack, sent letters and tapes claiming to be the Yorkshire Ripper and falsely implicated the Ripper in Harrison's murder. This diverted investigative resources and attention in the late 1970s, but subsequent analysis linked those hoax communications to other crimes, not Harrison's homicide. Humble was convicted in 2006 for perverting the course of justice related to those hoaxes. The matching of DNA evidence decades after the original crime reflected changes in forensic practice that allow cold cases to be revisited with tools that were not available at the time of the crime. DNA databases, improved laboratory methods, and more detailed evidence preservation have all contributed to solving historic homicides. Officials stated that the ability to link Smith's DNA to Harrison's case was significant because it eliminated lingering uncertainty about who committed the crime. Although law enforcement could not bring Smith before a court, the evidence supported a clear conclusion. Authorities continued to encourage anyone with information about other unresolved cases to come forward. Joan Harrison's murder in 1975 remained a part of Lancashire's criminal history until it was reconsidered within the context of improved forensic science. The match of DNA evidence to Christopher Smith's sample represented a conclusive association between a suspect and the homicide. Following the public announcement of the breakdown in the case, Harrison's name was formally added to records of resolved homicides in the United Kingdom, albeit with the qualification that no prosecution occurred due to the suspect's death. Local police emphasized the importance of retaining evidence and reviewing older cases as technological advances provide new investigative opportunities. The resolution of Joan Harrison 1975 case provided long-awaited answers for family members and the broader community that had remembered the original investigation. The findings demonstrated how cold case reviews and modern forensic techniques could provide clarity about cases that previously defied resolution. Investigators also noted that while the case was closed in terms of identifying the perpetrator, it remained a point of reflection about the challenges involved in historic homicide investigations, including limitations of the forensic technology available at the time of the crime and the impact of false leads. In official records, the Harrison murder is now documented with the conclusion that Christopher Smith was the likely perpetrator based on genetic evidence and corroborating statements. While the legal process could not proceed to prosecution due to his death, the scientific connection provided a factual resolution that had eluded investigators for decades.
In 1986, Cyrus E. Jefferson, age 37, was shot and killed in Siler City, North Carolina. Jefferson was a resident of Chatham County and described by those who knew him as a family man and employee in the local community. On the evening of March 30th, 1986, witnesses heard gunfire in the area of Jefferson's residence. Law enforcement personnel from the Siler City Police Department and the Chatham County Sheriff's Office were called to the scene along Poplar Street after neighbors reported multiple shots fired near Jefferson's home. When officers arrived, they found Jefferson lying outside with multiple gunshot wounds. Emergency medical personnel responded and transported him to Central Carolina Hospital, where he was pronounced dead. The medical examiner ruled the death a homicide due to multiple gunshot injuries. The crime occurred outdoors in a residential neighborhood, and there were no immediate witnesses who could identify the assailant or describe the events leading up to the shooting. Detectives began the investigation by securing the crime scene and documenting physical evidence. They photographed the location, noted the positions of spent shell casings, and collected ballistic evidence. Investigators canvassed the neighborhood, interviewing residents and anyone who may have heard or seen activity around the time of the shots. At the time, forensic technology was limited compared to later decades, and physical evidence, such as fingerprints and ballistic traces, were examined through the existing local and state crime lab resources. The initial investigation focused on determining whether Jefferson was involved in any disputes or conflicts that might have led to violence. Detectives interviewed family members, friends, and co-workers to understand Jefferson's recent activities and associations. They also reviewed his personal contacts and sought information about any unresolved issues or threats that had occurred before his death. Investigators identified several persons of interest during the early stages of the case. Multiple individuals who had been seen in the vicinity of Jefferson's residence on the night of the shooting were interviewed. However, none provided consistent or corroborated accounts that could be used to identify a suspect conclusively. Ballistic analysis was conducted on the shell casings recovered at the scene, and investigators consulted with the North Carolina State Bureau of Investigation to determine if the firearm used in Jefferson's killing had been used in other crimes. At the time, state and national ballistics databases were in their early stages, and no definitive matches were found. Chatham County detectives also examined Jefferson's financial records, personal relationships, and employment history. They sought to rule out motives such as robbery, personal retaliation, or other criminal activity. Investigators identified that Jefferson had been employed and had no known history of involvement in major disputes, although the possibility that he had encountered someone with a motive for violence could not be eliminated. During the initial months of the investigation, law enforcement officers conducted numerous interviews and processed evidence, but the case did not advance to an arrest. Over time, with no suspect identified or sufficient evidence to charge an individual, the investigation lost momentum. The file remained open, but active leads had stalled, and the case became part of the Chatham County Sheriff's Office cold case records. Detectives periodically reviewed the file and maintained the evidence in anticipation that future developments might allow new technology or information to produce results. In the decades that followed, Jefferson's family continued to seek answers, though there were few new leads. The unresolved homicide remained a source of uncertainty for family members and those who knew him. Law enforcement periodically revisited evidence when technology advanced, including improvements in forensic analysis and database capabilities. By the early 2000s and through the 2010s, forensic science, especially DNA analysis, had developed significantly. Biological evidence from cold cases could now be re-examined, even when initial testing had produced no usable results. Investigators reviewed the physical materials preserved from the Jefferson case, including any items that might contain trace biological materials. During one of these periodic reviews, detectives identified preserved materials that could be submitted for advanced testing. These items included clothing fragments and personal effects that had been collected at the scene in 1986. In the mid-2010s, these items were sent to a laboratory capable of conducting forensic DNA extraction from degraded materials. Using advanced laboratory methods that were not available at the time of the original investigation, genetic profiles were developed from material associated with the crime scene. Once a genetic profile was developed, investigators compared the DNA against state and national databases, including the Combined DNA Index System, CODIS. In the late 2010s, the DNA profile from the Jefferson case produced a match to a known individual, indicating that DNA evidence connected a specific person to the scene. The individual identified through the DNA match was 50-year-old David Wayne Dixon, a resident of nearby Raleigh, North Carolina, who had a criminal history that included convictions for violent offenses. Investigators reviewed Dixon's background and determined that he had previously lived in or near Siler City at the time of Jefferson's death, establishing his potential proximity to the crime scene. Armed with the DNA match and corroborating investigatory information, law enforcement obtained an arrest warrant for Dixon on a charge of first-degree murder in connection with Cyrus Jefferson's death. Detectives located Dixon and took him into custody without incident. He was held in the Chatham County Detention Facility pending initial court proceedings. During pre-trial hearings, prosecutors presented the DNA evidence linking Dixon to the homicide and documented the chain of custody for the physical evidence preserved from the original crime scene. Defense attorneys challenged aspects of the forensic analysis, seeking to question the reliability of DNA results developed from older, degraded samples. The court reviewed motions regarding the admissibility of the evidence in accordance with North Carolina law governing scientific testing and criminal procedure. In 2021, the case proceeded to trial in Chatham County Superior Court. The prosecution's case focused on the DNA match connecting Dixon's genetic profile to biological material recovered in association with the crime scene. Additional evidence included testimony regarding Dixon's presence in the region at or around the time of Jefferson's death, his criminal background, and investigatory findings that linked him to the physical evidence. During the trial, forensic experts from the laboratory that conducted the DNA analysis explained the methods used to extract and profile the genetic material from degraded samples. They described how the profile was developed and how it was matched to Dixon's DNA profile in the database with a high degree of scientific certainty. The prosecution also presented evidence to show that the DNA connection established Dixon's presence or involvement at the scene. In his defense, Dixon's attorneys argued that the DNA evidence was insufficient to prove guilt beyond a reasonable doubt and sought to raise questions about statistical interpretations and possible contamination over many years. Cross-examination focused on technical aspects of genetic testing and whether the laboratory procedures met the required standards. After reviewing all evidence and testimony, the jury deliberated and returned a guilty verdict on the charge of first-degree murder. The judge imposed a life sentence in accordance with North Carolina statutes governing murder convictions, with no eligibility for parole for a prescribed period, reflecting the severity of the crime. The conviction of David Wayne Dixon officially resolved the homicide of Cyrus Jefferson, a case that had remained unsolved for more than 30 years. Law enforcement officers involved in the cold case unit described the breakthrough as a direct result of advances in forensic science combined with persistent review of old evidence and investigatory diligence. Jefferson's surviving family members issued statements after the conviction, expressing that the outcome provided long-awaited answers and closure. They noted that Jefferson's death had remained unanswered for many years and that the conviction brought a measure of accountability after decades of uncertainty. The Chatham County Sheriff's Office documented the case as an example of how modern forensic technology can assist in resolving cold cases that once seemed unsolvable due to lack of leads. Investigators encouraged other jurisdictions with long-standing unsolved homicides to pursue DNA and forensic reviews of preserved evidence, noting that developments in technology had solved numerous cases once considered closed due to lack of leads. The conviction in the Cyrus Jefferson case served to close the investigatory file and provided a definitive legal resolution. Records reflect the details of the original crime, the preservation and testing of evidence, the identification of a suspect through DNA, and the subsequent prosecution that resulted in a life sentence. As of the latest updates, David Wayne Dixon remains incarcerated. The case is recorded in North Carolina Criminal Justice Archives as a solved homicide with documented evidence